Welcome to the Happy Mindset, episode 129. Today's episode is called The Audiobook. So today I'm going to play two chapters, the first two chapters from my book, Taking My Life Back, in audiobook format. So my new audiobook's been out with the last month, 2 months now. In October it was released by Tim Steer, is the narrator. Just wanted to give you a feel for the audiobook. If you haven't read the book, if you don't know much about my story, this will give you an insight into where everything began for me. The first two chapters are actually quite the most difficult, the most real, and the most raw in the book. And just wanted to share that today. It's just a word of warning that this could be triggering for somebody who's gone through something similar. It deals with a mental breakdown that I had in my early 20s. So I described that process, went back into the process again to describe it, to shed some light on it. When I was going through this process, it was a very dark and bleak time in my life. And it was actually hard to even bring a light on that 10 years later. It was through all the lessons I'd learned, which I share in the book, all the personal development lessons I'd learned over the years, that helped me to come back to this part of my life and to shine a light in it, to help me to make sense of it and to help other people who might be going through something similar to make sense of it in a way that's empowering. I'm always learning something new about the story, to be honest. It makes more and more sense as I move forward, the stuff I've gone through. But yeah, just wanted to play this today. So if you know somebody who might benefit from listening to this podcast, send it their way. Again, a word of warning, it might be triggering for somebody who's gone through something similar. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. And thanks again for listening.
Chapter 1. The Week from Hell. The only difference between genius and insanity is that genius has its limits. Albert Einstein. Crossing the line. A part of me knew I was drifting dangerously close to the edges of my sanity. As I reflect back on what happened almost a decade later, there are certain key memories that have left an imprint on me to this day. It was only beginning to really dawn on me that my thinking was becoming irrational, and I was slowly losing contact with reality when it was too late. As my thoughts became more and more erratic, and the stories more compelling, I was beginning to get a first-hand experience of the fine line that exists between sanity and insanity. With each passing moment, I was beginning to feel the proverbial straitjacket tighten its grip around me as I struggled in vain to break free from my now out-of-control mind. As I was writing out my thoughts in one of my streams of consciousness, I could clearly see that my thinking was getting more and more confused, to the point that I was warning myself to stop in the third person. This utterly freaked me out, and I decided to stop, but the damage had already been done. It was too late to turn back. My thoughts had already taken on a life of their own, and there was no stopping the momentum now. Messages from the television. The first major warning sign that something had changed in my brain happened as I sat watching the movie Ocean's 11 with some of the students. It was coming towards the end of my teaching assistantship in France. My French was at a near native level by then, and I had also begun to speak Spanish and Italian. A few months previously, I discovered language hacking, and I had been training my brain to think outside the box and combine patterns in new ways. I was inspired and very passionate about languages. I threw myself into it, and for 3 solid months, I completely immersed myself in my work. Unresolved emotions. These months were a whirlwind of emotion, as I felt anger, frustration, and passion all at the same time. I had so much passion for language hacking, but it somehow also managed to trigger a huge amount of anger and resentment I had been harbouring towards the education system. There were numerous other things that were also being triggered in me, including the students who looked at me as lazy because they didn't consider mental work real work. This also seemed to unearth resentments I was harbouring towards people in my life, who I felt had tried to define who I was in a negative way, or even the individuals I discovered who had told barefaced lies about me behind my back. Rural isolation. At this stage, I was living in a remote part of France, and I was beginning to spend vast portions of my weekends alone. This didn't bother me, as I was focused on cracking the language code and becoming a polyglot. However, in those days my brain had a huge tendency to ruminate and dwell on the past, but it never had this much time and space to ruminate before. Looking back, it was a recipe for disaster. But at this time, I was living in almost complete ignorance as to how my brain and my mind work. The first subtle hallucination. As I sat watching Ocean's 11, something changed in my hearing. The shift was so subtle, it's hard to find the right words to truly describe what actually changed. 1 minute I was watching the movie as if it was just another movie, and the next minute I had somehow started to hear a secret code playing behind the words in the movie. It seemed like it was always there, but I'd never noticed it before. The characters on screen were speaking to me in an indirect way. My brain was beginning to interpret the movie dialogue as being directly related to my life. Focus on the meaning, not the words. It was very subtle. Nothing had changed in the words spoken. The plot of the movie was still the same, but the meaning behind the words was fundamentally different. The movie was layered. On one level, there was the movie, and on another level, the actors were letting me know of what was being said behind my back, and they were also letting me know of what was happening in my life now and what was going to happen in the future. My brain was interpreting what they were saying metaphorically, which meant that it didn't matter what words they specifically used. It could always be related back to my life. It was the meaning that mattered, and not the specific words. Focusing on the meaning rather than the specific words was one of the insights that enabled me to start hacking foreign languages a few months prior to this. I didn't know what to think. It felt real, and I was aware that I was the only one noticing this. If I had tried to explain this change to someone else, they would have thought I was nuts. So I kept this first change in my perception to myself. The gradual alteration of my known world. Up until I attended a friend's birthday party, signs were appearing that all was not well, but I hadn't yet reached the point where I needed to send out an SOS for urgent help. The shift in my perception of movies gradually leaked its way into other programs. I was now interpreting negative and positive world events in the newspaper and on television as happening because of me. My interactions with other people was the next thing to be altered. Every conversation I was having, or any conversation I overheard, was about me. Even if the words held no relevance at all, my brain interpreted them in this way. My senses at this time were heightened, and on my final weekend in my dorm room, I had convinced myself that someone was trying to break in. When nobody was there and I went back to my room, even the slightest of noises had me on edge for the rest of the night. Alcohol, the tipping point. A drink of beer is what finally tipped me over the edge. I hadn't drunk alcohol for a couple of weeks, but once I had started to sip my first beer, all hell broke loose inside my head. Up until this point, my brain was highly sensitive to danger, and it was interpreting everything in an egocentric manner. Although this was a difficult and confusing experience, I was able to function and get on with my day. This all changed when the voices emerged. The controlling voices. At first, the whispers were sporadic. It felt like someone was whispering in my ear, but as I looked around me and noticed that everyone was carrying on as normal, I started to realize that something was wrong. The voices grew increasingly louder and more aggressive. It still felt like there was no way that these voices were coming from inside my own head. They were intrusive, judgmental, and relentless. I still thought they were definitely coming from somewhere external. This didn't sound like my internal life narrator. I don't think I was aware of the narrator inside my head back then, but I was hearing multiple voices in the same way your ears would perceive people talking and shouting at you. These voices were threatening, menacing, and utterly terrifying to listen to. As I rushed to the bathroom and the voices followed me, I knew I was in serious trouble. There was no distance between the voices and my sense of self. They had completely overpowered me. In a rational mind, when a conscious thought or a bunch of conscious thoughts enter your head, you intuitively know you have the freedom to accept, reject, or even ignore them. You might sometimes feel uncomfortable with the type of thoughts entering your mind, but you can generally manage to carry on and shrug it off. Until you start believing and internalizing the thoughts, you know that the thoughts can't make you do anything you don't want to do, and they can't bully you. You know thoughts are powerless without action. That part of my brain was somehow gone, and I was up shit creek without a paddle. I walk alone. I was at the party for a night and half of the following day. It was all a blur to me the following day, as some of the people I was with quizzed me on whether I was okay and whether I had taken any drugs. Although the night was a blur between auditory and visual hallucinations, I can remember some of the thoughts and the emotions I felt. I can remember feeling terrified when the voices appeared. This was followed by confusion and feelings of being completely alone in the world. I also felt a huge amount of regret when I thought I had died. I can remember thinking people were plotting against me. Rooms also looked different to what they first looked like when I got to the party. One person looked like the Grim Reaper. Conspiracy theories ran through my head, while the words of a Green Day song, "I Walk Alone," echoed in my ears. I can remember calling my parents for help and speaking at 100 miles an hour. There were religious undertones to some of my hallucinations. The host had a pet snake, which reminded me of the Garden of Eden. At one point, I was the Messiah, and I thought people would betray me and eventually also kill me because I knew too much about how the world works. I would later learn from reading Brain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan that these sorts of thoughts and emotions can come from an overstimulation of the temporal lobes in the brain, the part which houses the hippocampus and amygdala, which are responsible for emotion and memory. A false reality. It wasn't just my conscious thoughts that were being altered. It was my entire perception. I was trapped inside a false reality where I couldn't trust my feelings, thinking, hearing, or sight, my perception of life itself. A few days later, I was on a plane home from France. As one of the teachers drove me to the airport, I had hallucinations about her saying strange things, breaking speed limits, and telling me the police turned a blind eye to it for the teachers at the school. Going home. When I arrived home to Ireland, I had become so confused by my experience that I found myself questioning where I had spent the past year. I thought to myself that none of my family and friends had seen any of the people I was with in France. I wondered whether it was all a figment of my imagination, that perhaps the school didn't even exist, and I'd spent the year in the wilderness by myself. The whole thing was a blur. At the start, I was trying to make sense of it all with my thinking. I was trying to make sense of a surreal and distorted reality with the same types of thoughts that were creating it. Thankfully, I eventually realized the futility behind this. What is reality? It's difficult to truly convey what the experience was like to someone who hasn't had a similar experience. As I have mentioned, it wasn't the experience of my conscious mind simply telling me a bunch of lies that I was innocently believing. Rather, in these moments, my perception of reality had fundamentally been altered, and my brain was trying to make sense of what was happening, while it was playing its part in creating this new reality. It felt like I was in another realm, fully immersed in the madness of my unconscious mind. I didn't have any words to describe what I was experiencing, and I had no idea what the future now had in store for me. However, what I did know was that I could never unsee what I had just seen. My life was either going to go down a very dark and bleak path, or I was going to somehow manage to create an uplifting path for myself, built from the lessons chaos was intent on teaching me. Chapter 2. The Label. What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. Carl Jung. Arriving home from France. I was relieved that finally a professional had a word that explained that what I had been experiencing over the past couple of days was in fact very real. I had just come back from France a few days earlier. Between the visual and auditory hallucinations, I am surprised I was able to make it home in one piece. The most frustrating part about experiencing a problem with your brain is that it plays out completely inside your own head. At first, nobody believes you. Or if they do, they think you're on drugs or being overly dramatic. Nobody could comprehend just how bad it was. I mean, how could they know? I didn't even know this was possible myself. My brain had had enough, and now it felt like it had turned on me. For all I knew, the Salvador Dali-like reality I had somehow managed to find myself in was perhaps what the rest of my life was going to look like. A waking nightmare. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that taking my mental health for granted could ever lead me here. When I eventually saw a psychiatrist, his assessment shed light on the fact that my brain was in a state of psychosis. Initially, I didn't put much thought into what this meant. I was too out of it at this stage, not knowing what to believe anymore. I had been living with auditory and visual hallucinations for nearly a week at this point. My paranoia had been feeding me all sorts of stories, and I was completely disillusioned by everything and everyone. Bouncing between mania and depression. On top of this, the emotions I was experiencing were a blend of mania and depression. In one moment, I felt on top of the world with the clearest of minds, and in the next, there was a black cloud hung over me, and the world was out to get me and make a fool of me. Once I had received the correct antipsychotic medication, Abilify, the hallucinations disappeared almost immediately. The extremity in my emotions also waned. However, the memories stayed with me, and I was functioning like a zombie, terrified and confused by my reality for quite some time after this. The fear of social stigma. All of these emotions I kept locked up on the inside. I had all these doubts about my long-term mental health. At one point, I was worried that I was displaying early onset signs of schizophrenia. For a long time, I kept all these emotions and thoughts to myself. I didn't want social stigma to make my situation even worse. This was Ireland in 2010, a time before there was any conversations about mental health in the mainstream. I was afraid if anyone knew what had happened to me, then it would affect my job prospects and even my prospects of keeping and making friends. Looking back on this time, I am glad I kept my emotions and thoughts to myself. I needed someone I could trust and who could actually understand what I had been through. An understanding not purely from a textbook point of view, but from an experiential one. I wouldn't have been able to distinguish such a person with the headspace I was in at this time. The words antipsychotic and psychotic episode. Initially, when the psychotic episode happened, I spent all my energy trying to harness my will to make myself better. Taking medication was the last thing I wanted to do. My logic was that if I didn't take medication, then this never happened, that I'm not mad, and that I would never have to deal with the words psychotic episode and antipsychotic medication. Thankfully, I began to realise that the problem with crazy people is that they don't realise they're crazy. Accepting I had a problem opened up the doors to receive help. I wasn't supposed to drink alcohol while on medication. At that time, I couldn't imagine functioning in a social setting without a drop of alcohol. One of the side effects of the medication was that I frequently felt lethargic and lacking in energy, and I would often need to go for a nap during the day. While taking medication was difficult for my body on a physical level, it was even more challenging for me to accept on a mental and an emotional level. The dark side of living in ignorance. I think the toughest part for me to deal with mentally was the language that was used to describe my condition. Imagine within a matter of a week going from someone who identified as a normal and functioning human being to all of a sudden needing to process and make sense of words like psychotic episode and antipsychotics. When my mind thought of these words, it immediately saw images of straitjackets, crazy people, people convulsing, and even electric shock treatment. My mind had no way of separating a person from their condition when it came to mental health issues. I didn't learn about any of this at school, and I was a college graduate at this stage. It was easy for me to see that a person is not their broken leg. If someone broke a leg, I had no frame of reference for other people referring to someone as the guy or girl who broke their leg. However, I did have frames of reference in my mind for people who referred to other people as the person who had had a breakdown, or the person who is mad. Viewing my temporary condition as myself. At that time, all these words represented a reality I refused to acknowledge, let alone allow myself to live in. A reality where some people would refer to me as mad behind my back, and a reality where I would live in a sedative manner to numb and ignore the pain. So I took my medication and left this world as quickly as I entered it. It was clear to me that in this world I was viewing myself through the lens of my condition, and I would never fully recover as long as this perception remained in place. Breaking my predefined limitations. I didn't seek counselling. I didn't look for advice. And I didn't look for someone to explain my experience to me. By this stage, I had had more than enough of letting the outside world define who I was. Don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful to the psychiatrist and the medication for bringing my brain back into balance. I was one of the lucky ones. The first drug he prescribed me worked. But there was no human spirit here, just a diagnosis, prognosis, and drugs. My intention was a full recovery, and to see this as an opportunity to build my life on a solid foundation this time around. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. At this point, it's important to mention that when I was in this most helpless and vulnerable of states, my initial impulse was to try and jump out of it as quickly as possible and forget it ever happened. But in turning a blind eye to it and accepting the normal way of perceiving mental illness as a skeleton to be kept firmly shut in the closet, I would have lost so many invaluable lessons and insights. These lessons have taught me more about life and human potential than 18 years of formal education.